Welcome, everyone. This weekend is a weekend, if things had gone the way that we had dreamed and hoped, we would all be in the beautiful Hanseatic city of Tallinn, Estonia. We would have been there because that's where we were going to be this weekend last year. And it is a hope, if things go well, where we will be this weekend next year. So I guess 3 times is the charm. But CCPC has always prided itself on trying to build up philosophical community as one of its paramount values, figuring that a view of global philosophy in which we're all little atomistic commentators on the world isn't the world. You know, that not only do we have to think about the full range of human philosophical activity on a global scale, but we also have to experiment in ways of enacting it. And so towards community this year, this is the best we can do right now, getting together on Zoom for an afternoon. But we thought that we would, given the hell of a year that it's been, celebrate community by having our annual Compass Award. And as you all know, the Compass Award this year is going to a very deserving recipient, John Maraldo, who will be giving a paper today. The Compass Award includes, in this package, a compass. It's monogrammed to John Maraldo, and it includes this plaque. This plaque was prepared and done by hand by Jennifer Liu. So it's a handmade plaque. And on it, John Maraldo is recognized for paving the way to a more inclusive and compassionate world, and for a career promoting philosophy in its global diversity. And his compass, of course, is in recognition of all that he has done through his many decades for showing us all the way, helping us all in our wayfinding activities. John is no stranger to anybody in this meeting today. His production has been extraordinary, both in terms of how he's lived his life, the sorts of things he's dedicated his life to doing, and to, of course, his many publications. They're legion. I won't go through them all, but I'll point to 3 that are very special to my heart and very cherished by CCPC members. The first is this 2-volume edition right here, representing many years of work on John's part. Volume 1 of Japanese Philosophy in the Making, Crossing Paths with Nishida, and Volume 2 of Japanese Philosophy in the Making, Borderline Interrogations. Amen to that. And of course, it's now become almost impossible to imagine appreciating the Japanese philosophical tradition in English without this extraordinary volume, many years in the making, and of which John was one of its editors. And it's really, really a treasure. So with great pride, we present the Compass Award to John Maraldo. We'll have a 40-minute presentation from John, Humans and Other Animals, Stories That Place Us Together and Their Epistemic Value. And then a 10-minute response, first by Leah Kalmanson, second by Bret Davis, and then we have about 50 minutes for discussion. There's 2 ways to be recognized for a question or a comment. One will be to go to the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click it and choose raise hand. That'll put you visibly at the beginning of the queue. Or if you're not comfortable with that, in the chat, just write question and push return, and I'll see that. So either raise your hand in reactions or just type in question and we'll get right to you. So it is with great pride and great happiness I present to you this year's extremely well-deserving Compass Award winner, John Maraldo. Thank you, John. It's a really great honor for you to be here.
Thank you, Jason Wirth. This is my honor. And I see it really as a recognition of the importance of cross-cultural and intercultural philosophy that so many of us here practice and cherish. So I would like to congratulate the Comparative and Continental Philosophy Circle, especially its founders and the organizers, for really encouraging and facilitating work in this field that had hardly begun when I began my career. And I know the journal of the circle and its annual conferences have been really happy occasions for us to meet together and for our ideas to meet. I wish we could be together in person together today, and I'm sure many of you would rather be celebrating in Tallinn, Estonia, rather than in front of your camera. But wherever you are, I hope you are well and thriving. So my talk today reflects a relatively new venture for me, and it's an old topic really, but for me it's a new approach, more informal and adventurous, I guess, than my usual work, and maybe more relevant to concerns beyond philosophy. So over the past year and a half, at the same time I was writing a rather specialized and more technical book about Zen history, I found myself drawn more and more into an area in which I have great interest, but little expertise.
John, I think you got muted somehow. Could you push your unmute button?
Sorry, how much of my talk got muted?
About 2 minutes only.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened there. I think everybody got muted. So I was saying that my talk today it's a relatively new venture for me. It's an old topic really, but for me it's a new approach, a bit more informal and adventurous than my usual work, and maybe more relevant to concerns beyond philosophy. So over the past year and a half, during our self-imposed isolation, I've been writing a rather specialized and technical book about Zen history. But I found myself also drawn more and more into this area in which I have a lot of interest, but little expertise. And my guides into this area have been voices that I think are all too often ignored in philosophical research. So I'll tell you whose voices they are soon enough. I want today to present some ideas, especially about how these voices communicate. It happens that in the book about Zen history, too, modes of communications played an important role, particularly the mode of what I called Zen legends. But wandering into this, what I thought would be a totally unrelated field, I came across other unexpected conjunctions with Zen history, such as the notion that a biological species is an evolutionary lineage of participants in an ongoing path of life. Today, though, let me read to you the paper that I've written about humans and other animals, according to some stories. One frigid winter, not many years ago, the American Chickasaw poet Linda Hogan walked out of her cabin in the Colorado mountains into tall mounds of frozen whiteness. Concerned about getting enough nourishment to her horse and burro, she shoveled the snow aside to make a path, and then carried a heavy bale of hay to their stalls in the barn. A few hours later, as the light of day began to fade, she was toting another load around a corner of the path when, in her words, she encountered thick winter fur, 4 great legs, hooves, and enormous great antlers worn like a crown, as if I should bow to him. It is Wapiti, a huge bull elk. He stands large before me, she writes. We are of 2 different minds, 2 species, 2 ways of being, 2 lives, both fragile for the moment, and neither of us able to even back up, move away from the other. We continue sizing up what we know of each other. To him, I could be a most dangerous animal. A boundary of not knowing stands between us as temporary fear. We live by different maps of this world. The golden elk exhales as if there is no choice but to survive with one another. I look down, not to appear a threat. His teeth click as if he will bite. Perhaps he's forgotten the weapons on his head. I think a moment, then speak to him gently and walk past and back into the barn. In the following few days, Linda leaves some alfalfa on the path for the great Wapiti, and she recalls how each day we 2 animals learn a life together. It's a relationship, the only word that addresses this kind of connection, conveys the eventual lack of danger, and how 2 species new to one another learn to survive together. I feel, smell, and see his breath. He watches me move. This is part of how we speak. But his teeth still click together as if to warn, do not come too close. I ask permission, and each time I pass, I speak, look down, and pass around him as if the great antlers do not exist, and he allows the way. Living with her beloved horses, Linda Hogan often talks to them and marvels at how they know her intentions, as if her gestures, the very ones she herself does not notice, speak wordlessly to them. Our intent is felt through the slightest movement of the human body, down to the spine, to the horse mind, she says. Their common tongue speaks to her of a unique tangle and web of kinship and love. Both my horse and burro seem now to be a part of the spirit of this mountain, forest, and earth where we live, as if we are part of it all. When I work with them, brushing or using a medicine, I sing, as I do not sing before people. I sing horse songs learned from my Chickasaw childhood. Now, where that affinity does not exclude distance and difference, Hogan remarks on the inscrutable otherness she knows intimately from her life experiences in near wilderness. Each nation of animals joins with all the others in an undivided terrestrial intelligence that encompasses the close and the distant. Close is the familiar feel of her horses, but also a heart that stops for a moment at seeing 5 mysterious wolves who cross her vision one misty morning, or at hearing the uncanny cry of a mountain lion, which she knows to listen to in silence as it announces it's somewhere near. Those of us who live in wild zones know that wildlife is not meant for us, she says. It does not belong to us, nor we to them. The fox who avoids her but tolerates her presence lives on the other side of being human. Now, another side of being human is told in this story. One day in the early 1970s, a young Zuni hunter in New Mexico was lucky enough to come across a female deer, a doe, that stood unmoving in front of him. He was an inexperienced young hunter who shot the deer with a rifle. When it was dying, he sucked the remaining breath from its nostrils to preserve his relationship with all animals. If he had been more experienced, instead of shooting it and leaving a hole in the skin, he might have approached the deer by singing a ritual song and smothering it with cornmeal, then insert his knife into her belly. If she was a deer that perhaps had once been a human living off cooked food, she could be reborn a deer only 3 more times. But if she had always been a deer, then year after year they might hunt her and send her back over there to be reborn as a deer. In any case, the family prepared the body in ritual-like actions that seemed akin to a funeral and celebration of life. Tola placed a speckled forked corn ear, the female kind, against Doe's breast, where her heart once was. Gathering around the doe, everyone took up a handful of cornmeal, and Hapia started singing her home. Between stanzas, we dusted her with jeweled cornmeal till head, neck, and shoulders were coated fluffy white, and she was on her way. Barbara Tedlock tells this story, and it straddles different sides of being human. Tedlock is an anthropologist who lived in the American Southwest with native Zuni people. Now, the practice of killing an animal for food would seem to violate any felt kinship with other animals. Although humans wage lethal war often enough, human societies typically have prescriptions against killing other humans, and especially against eating them. And these prescriptions indicate boundaries between humans and other animals that humans kill and eat, often without any hesitation at all. So when indigenous peoples hunt and eat other animals, that would seem to mark an inviolable difference for them between humans and the non-human. But listen to this hunting story. When you track an animal, you must become the animal. When the tracks show it jumps, you jump. This is the great dance. When I was running, I really was a kudu antelope. It's a long time since I felt like this. When you feel kudu is with you, you are now moving in unison. Its eyes are no longer wild. You have taken kudu into your own mind. You think how hard kudu is working. You feel it in your own body. That's the story told by a San Bushman hunter in the Kalahari Desert, where hunting means affiliation with the hunted and the eaten. An observation about what the San do not hunt tells of affiliation through mutual distancing. During the unciphered span of time that the San people lived as hunters, they did not hunt lions. Their courtesy was repaid. Lions and the San had somehow forged a solid truce. Even taking prey from lions outnumbered by them, the San spoke to the lions firmly but respectfully. It was a respect not paid to leopards or hyenas. No one had ever heard of a lion killing a human. The San never hunted the lions. Lions never hunted the San. Perhaps each side knew that the other was potentially dangerous. Each could have tested the other's limits, yet they did not. They chose not to tamper with one another. They lived well without doing so and passed the custom on to their children. Some hunting stories reveal an adverse form of affiliation, the sorry consequences of a violation of a truce or tacit agreement with other animals. In Siberia, the Udge and Nanai hunters of old, it is told, knew enough to stay out of a tiger's way, but they left a cut of their hunted meat for the tiger. Human hunters sometimes scavenged from tiger kills, but the balance of power yielded a kind of mutual courtesy, an understanding of mutual nonviolence. Once, modern hunters forced a tiger off its kill and took some of the meat. The hunters tell how after that, The tiger destroyed our crops. He scared off the animals that came to our bait. If any kind of animal got close, he would roar and everyone would run away. That tiger would not let us hunt for an entire year. At another particularly lean time, a hunter decided to eliminate a tiger that he perceived as a competitor. He set up a trap with a tripwire connected to a gun. The tiger tripped the wire, but avoided the bullet. It then went after the hunter, went directly to his cabin without even following his tracks. It knew exactly where the hunter lived. It waited several days for the hunter to emerge before it finally left. If a hunter fired a shot at a tiger, that tiger would track him down, even if it took him 2 or 3 months. Tigers will sit and wait specifically for the hunter who has fired shots at them, these people tell. Here's another story about a group of hunters, but not about their hunting, rather about their sense of loss. Old Blue was an alpha male who struggled to keep up with his pack, and one day he died. The next day, his mate did something no wolf scientist had ever seen. She left. She left her territory, left the children who were her pack, left the 9-month-old pups, unheard of. She wandered westward through the snow, miles and miles. A week later, she returned, reuniting with her family. Some wolves howl for days after losing a mate. I don't know what a mother elk does when she loses her calf, but one summer living right next to a ranch in New Mexico, we listened to cows wail for 3 days after their calves were taken from them, away to the enormous feedlots of Kansas and Colorado. Elephants will mourn their dead and often cover the bones with branches and leaves. Foxes will bury their kin. Gorillas will display profound grief. And the ho'okana bird, the Hawaiian crow, now almost extinct, will cry out for weeks after it has lost its mate. Well, by now you must be wondering when I'm going to stop telling stories and start doing philosophy, or at least tell you what I think these stories mean. I would be content with the words of other people and what animals tell us, with the way stories communicate and educate as well as entertain. But I suppose we philosophers are often impatient with storytelling. So let me first say a few words about stories, then I'll return to what I've told and how it might inform us. When I was teaching introductory philosophy over the decades, I would try to convince young students that there's an alternative to their belief that everything they learn is either factual information or else mere opinion. And everybody has a right to their own opinion, as we know. So I taught them that philosophy works with neither simple factual information nor mere opinion. Rather, when we do philosophy, we give reasons and evaluate arguments. I usually forgot to mention stories. Even though myths and narratives and interpretation itself have often enough been themes in philosophical writing, of course, stories don't make truth claims, and so they're simply sidekicks to the discovery of truth in what actually counts, right? Nothing new there. So I was taken aback when I noticed how prevalent stories are in scientific literature about human interactions with animals. Not only do anthropologists and ethologists and indigenous peoples use stories to make their points, some writers more boldly say that wolves, as well as people, tell them stories. Indeed, that many animals tell each other stories and live in a storied world that they co-create. Together, they create meaning that is communicated historically, parent to child, one generation to another. Yes, I'm talking about non-human animals. The Australian philosopher and anthropologist Tom von Doren makes the strongest case for such claims and he invokes the research of many other writers. I'll not try to prove his point here, but I heartily recommend his book called Flightways: Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction. Let me recap briefly and then elaborate the most striking observations about stories. Stories betoken the ability to engage with happenings in the world as sequential and meaningful events, Van Doren says. They hold open perspectives and possibilities. They weave together connections and relationships. They are place-making and generate meaning. Stories need not be spoken in words. Now, to elaborate a bit and wander into the non-human, stories allow us to hold open simultaneously a range of points of view, interpretations, temporalities, and possibilities. They can straddle past and present and foretell future in an entanglement of time. They interrelate the storyteller and the story characters and implicate all together in a common open-ended world. So if a single objective view from nowhere is supposed to count as the view of the real world, then stories resist a division between the real and the narrated world. As narrative, stories do not simply reflect chronological sequence. They weave together events and actors really in two ways: by recounting events in what we commonly call storytelling, but also by relating an actor's storied experience of the world, Van Doren says. That experience is interactive at base. Stories pattern the world and participate in its becoming. They co-make the world. Non-human animals are among the actors. Animal subjects, as well as human subjects, construct their world. Organisms actively interpret their surroundings as replete with meaningful signs. Non-humans too not only perceive, but also represent their surroundings. And those surroundings are not simply an independent environment that surrounds them, but they're their enfolding world, their Umwelt, as it's called. They leave signs for one another and designate specific places not reducible to interchangeable habitats. So stories are personal and communal. They anticipate listeners or readers. They can express what Donna Haraway calls situated knowledge. Now, most striking to me is the claim that non-human animals tell stories, even if not, or not always, in spoken words. When a vervet monkey cries out a sound that ethologists as well as fellow monkeys interpret immediately as leopard, wouldn't this be a spoken word? Now, I know it's still a matter of debate among linguists whether any non-human animals are able to use signs with syntax. Of course, the evidence for signative communication among non-human animals is indispensable, is indisputable. But consider this, that the vervet monkey's cry of leopard might entail as much syntax as a mason's utterance of brick when he calls to an assistant in building a wall. Indigenous peoples employ a differentiated but maybe less linguistic conception of language when they speak of communicating with other beings or of non-human animals speaking to each other. Researchers have probably spent more time, trying to teach animals human languages than learning how animals communicate among themselves. I've found two sources of evidence for the claim that non-human animals communicate through signs with others of like kind, and sometimes with human animals. Of course, telling stories is a big step beyond simply using signs or uttering meaningful sounds, whether they count as words or not. For non-human storytelling, we need evidence of storied communication, as Van Doren calls it. So he and other writers who interpret animal behavior are not simply imagining that non-humans express what we can interpret as stories. They take their cues from human storytelling and present evidence that non-human animals themselves interpret behavior as storied. Let me pause here just a minute to add an observation to Van Doren's and other writers that he draws from. I mentioned the claim that they make about non-human stories, and now I mention evidence for it. So if you want to take what I'm saying as an argument, I won't stop you, but please notice another prominent feature of the story form of communication. Stories do not function as a set of self-contained propositions, objective and divorced from involvement of their claimer and leading up to an argument. Stories might be told by a single storyteller, human or not, and surely the trustworthiness of the teller may count for a lot, but stories gain their currency through repeated enactment. That's what makes them history. If they make claims, the claims often take shape as ethical exhortations. An exhortation, for example, to take ethics as interspecies, which means to understand non-humans as ethical subjects who generate meaning, socially construct their world, and educate their progeny, who recognize individuality and autonomy and manifest subjectivity in other ways. Let me repeat one observation that anyone with a pet will verify. Our non-human kin actively interpret their surroundings as replete with meaningful signs. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So back to the first source of evidence for non-human storytelling. That evidence is presented by ecologists, and more often than not, they present it in story form. If you read ecologist Carl Safina's book called Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel, there you'll hear stories about elephants and wolves and other mammals, crows and rooks and other birds, among scores of Earth's inhabitants who communicate and hold signs as well as events in memory. Now, perhaps non-human animal signs are more embodied and less abstracted or articulated than ours, but they can be quite clear. One wolf crawling on its belly up to another wolf signals non-threatening intent, even intense submission to all the wolves around. Non-human animals can also intentionally deceive. Vervet monkeys will sometimes cry leopard when their troop is losing a fight with another troop, but no leopard is around. Non-human animals can recall and evaluate past events and communicate their evaluation. Crows remember for years the faces of researchers who have caught and handled them for purposes like marking and measuring. When the crows see these people again, they loudly scold them, and other crows learn who these seemingly bad and dangerous humans are. And the crows give warning signs, warning alarms at the sight of them. The crows remember human behavior, and they remember the signs that tell of that behavior. And they tell about to one another, one crow to another, parent to child. Now that sounds like storytelling to me. Besides the stories of ethologists, the stories that indigenous peoples relate tell of non-human animals who talk in their own ways to whoever will listen. These people speak of their direct communication with animals as if they shared a language that our stories usually relegate to mythic convention. About 120 years ago on the high plains of lower North America, Chief Luther Standing Bearer of the Lakota people said, "Kinship with all creatures of the earth, sky, and water was a real and active principle. For the animal and bird world, there existed a brotherly feeling that kept the Lakota safe among them. And so close did some of the Lakotas come to their feathered and furred friends that in true brotherhood, they spoke a common tongue. In the early 1990s, I talked to the Puebloan anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz in north central New Mexico. I learned that he had recorded stories that, in his words, arise out of the earth, the plants, herbs, and animals, which are integral parts of the human realm. In the Indian imagination, he wrote, there's no division between the animal and human spheres. Each takes the other's clothing, shifting appearances at will. Animals of different species speak freely not only to one another, but to humans as well. Some of today's medicine men still claim to understand the language of certain animals. Most likely it's out of range for us now to hear the voices of non-human animals, perhaps even to hear what these Native Americans and their stories are saying. We think their stories are anthropomorphic. What can we take then reasonably from these stories? You've already heard the story about Linda Hogan talking to the elk and to her horse and burro. She takes the word language in a broad sense and writes, bird and animal languages are many, so are the languages of trees. The forest has exceedingly complex methods of communication still being discovered. Non-human languages we've learned are more plentiful than just the well-documented songs of water mammals who fill the oceans, more also than the enormous vocabularies of crows and ravens, or the endangered prairie dogs at the edge of many towns, small burrowing animals who use numerous nouns to describe persons passing by with a language so richly developed it has syntax and other elements common to ours. Hogan speaks to animals both tame and wild by soft voice and by song, in what seems like it should be common sense. We notice here an attitude of human affiliation with animals that I think has been a factor leading to the rediscovery of animal languages, where language was for centuries the symbol of the dividing line between human and all else. Now, I don't wish to underestimate the ways that indigenous peoples do divide themselves from other animals and from other humans, but the divisions of indigenous peoples are often not as immutable or inviolable as ours typically are. Barbara Tedlock notes that Zunis can consider predatory animals to be hunters, warriors, and curers, just as humans are. Zunis must also consider humans as predatory animals. In the Zuni story, the ritualistic treatment of the deer body made the deer seem human. And the Zuni view of life makes humans seem like fellow animals. But not all animals are good fellows, and not all indigenous peoples are inclusive in the same way. For one thing, what counts as human and what counts as not human appears to be quite different from what we are used to saying. When I talk about humans and other animals, of course, I put both in the same category and differentiate them at the same time. But not all peoples divide the world up this way. Linda Hogan tells us that the Chickasaw word for animal is nanokcha, meaning all alive. In our human place, she says, we are only one of the Earth's beings, surrounded by other intelligences we seek to understand, including insects, she says. Those are the flies and mosquitoes and spiders that I'm more likely to place on the other side of what counts as a friendly animal. The Ojibwe scholar, Winoa Laduk, says that she often hears the word Dinawama Ganinadog, meaning all our relatives, not just with those with 2 legs, but those with 4 legs or wings or fins. Ultimately, it may be ethnocentric to see indigenous ontologies simply as anthropocentric, anthropomorphic. The Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro tells stories of Amerindians who say that peccaries, these are the mammals that look like pigs in South and Central America. These Amerindians say that these peccaries are humans, as are other living things who share their forests. Well, not exactly, not all are, and not all the time. And not only animals, but also plants sometimes under some circumstances. The word animal and human are, Viveros says, equivocal translations of certain indigenous words. For our part, we can't believe, as some Amerindians apparently do, that peccaries are humans. And after all, the propositional rule says that if we take the natives seriously, we don't take ourselves seriously, and vice versa, either or. In contrast, stories suggest a different grammar of belief and often invite an epoche or suspension of judgment about facts. Viveros says we are misled if we think that such reports tell us about the people who believe such things, not about what is believed, that is about the animals. But the point for him is that the humans in question are saying not only something about the peccaries, but also about what it is to be human. Perhaps we should be talking about animals and other humans, as well as humans and other animals. Felt kinship and affinity and alterity are not uniformly expressed among native peoples. Viveros notes that, for example, for the native Amazonian Piro people, the jaguar is the antithesis of kinship. So I would suggest the word affiliation, because that can include adverse association as well as felt affinity. Notice how the native expresses an intimate possibility even within adversity. As Viveros puts it, to avoid being devoured by the jaguar, one need know how to assume its point of view as the point of view of the self. The recognition that others, both friendly and hostile, both human and non-human, have a point of view is what Viveros calls perspectivism, to explain Amerindian thought. Perspectivism is the idea that the world is inhabited by different sorts of subjects or persons, human and non-human, which apprehend reality from distinct points of view. Viveros gives an extended argument that this idea is distinctly not relativist. I'll skip the argument and move on to another story, this one about how we and an animal might just share a perspective and stand on the same side of a problem. Just 2 weeks ago, a breeding herd of elephants in South Africa's Kruger National Park trampled a suspected rhino poacher to death. In 2019, a suspected rhino poacher was killed by an elephant and then devoured by lions, the park officials reported. Similar stories reveal that some animals act out of care for their Umwelt, their surrounding, their felt experiential world, and not merely out of territorial defense. In fact, maybe the most territorial of all animals is we humans. Many of us would rather exclude the wild from our Umwelt. The wolf is the ancestor of the animal most befriended by humans. The wolf is an accomplished hunter and team player, but wolves have been imagined as man's worst enemy. Wolves completely disappeared in Japan, as you know, and they went nearly extinct in the continental United States and much of Western Europe. Hunted to death not for food, but out of fear or out of resentment for eating what we eat. Wolves reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park now prey on elk and keep the elk population manageable, which keeps the native grasses growing. But when the wolves wander outside the park, they lose their individual identity and face human predators who begrudge their existence. I've been emphasizing the affiliation of humans and other animals, yet you probably noticed that I've been inserting a lot of us versus them into the picture. So how am I placing this us and ours versus them and theirs? I've relied on your intuitions here, but just to make it clear, our relation to animals began with my stance as a North American comparative philosopher living in the urban United States, like many of you in a highly industrialized nation. Some of the indigenous peoples, like the Amur Indians that Viveros studies, live on the edge of the industrial world in Amazonia, or what remains of it. Other native peoples, like the Zuni in New Mexico, continue to live within an industrialized world that desecrates the environment from which they get their bearings. We are joined by, more than we might imagine, by humans and non-humans who sense in their bones an impending loss, the loss of a viable home, the loss of those who now live on the brink, the disappearing indigenous human groups, as well as the endangered animal species. I connect this loss to our stories of what humans are and what is due them. Not only what we think is owed to us as privileged beings, but also what is due to our ways of living, what we're responsible for. And when we do tell alternative stories, I know we risk overgeneralizing or romanticizing or exoticizing, or maybe anthropomorphizing the non-human and de-animalizing the human. But for now, for my reference points, I've intentionally bypassed the philosophers who have written more concretely about human animality and often more abstractly about the animal. I've encouraged attention to stories and to indigenous peoples and anthropologists who tell them, and to the cries and songs, the growls and grunts and howls and body signals of non-human animals, and the stories of ecologists who translate them. So my talk today is mixed stories and statements, but I've avoided analysis and argument. Let me end this meandering excursion by recalling without comment a few statements that might just inspire new storytelling to visualize affiliations between humans and other animals and ways to restore our nature. Maybe these observations can act as a compass to point out some directions. Here, they're all in the form of quotations or close paraphrase. What obligations do we have to hold open a space in the world for other living beings, to reserve a place for them, their own place, their home? This is from Tom Van Doren. Human nature is and will always be an interspecies relationship, Anat Singh says. To know is to personify, to take the point of view of what should be known, or rather, the one who should be known, Eduardo Viveros. To know the pine tree, take after the pine tree. To know the bamboo, take after the bamboo. Basho, of course. To know is to totally become the thing. And what we call the self has to be known from the standpoint of the world, Nishida Kitaro. And finally, although humans have deeply understood what is in seas and rivers as water, just what kind of thing fish and other beings understand and use as water, we do not yet know. Do not foolishly assume that all kinds of beings must use as water what we understand as water. It's not the case simply that there is water in the world. Within water, there is a world, wrote Dogen. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, John. That was a beautiful paper. And as we try to think not only about the full human community of the Logos, you challenge us quite powerfully and beautifully to think about all of our affiliations, human and non-human. That could not be more in the spirit of the Compass Award and our circle, and deep bows to you. Thank you so much. And we have now our first respondent, Leah Kalmanson.
Hi, everybody. I guess you can all hear me okay. Wow, I'm incredibly honored to be here today doing this to offer a few words for Dr. Maraldo as he's receiving this Compass Award. As I was preparing for this, I was reading Dr. Maraldo's presentation, and I was also on my library's website, looking back over some of the greatest hits in his long career. And so I really want to start off by saying and by emphasizing that it's scholars like Dr. Maraldo who make scholars like me possible. So I'm really grateful for the work that he's done that's opened so many doors. And another thing I was thinking as I was preparing for this, it occurred to me that when Jason called me and invited me to say a few words today, it occurred to me, I kind of wish, and I hope this doesn't sound weird when I say it, but I kind of wish I told him to ask Sarah Matthijs instead. And let me explain why. Most of you here probably know Sarah. She graduated from Hawaii around the same time I did. And even if you don't know her personally, you might know that she was hired to fill the position left when Dr. Maraldo retired from the University of North Florida. So Sarah is one of my best friends, and I'm really impressed with everything she does, and I'm really proud of her. And so for years now, whenever I introduce her to people that don't know her, I say, oh, this is Sarah Matthijs, she's the one in John Maraldo's old position at UNF. Because for me, being asked to fill John Maraldo's shoes is such an honor. It's such a mark of distinction. And so when I introduce Sarah, there's no better way for me to express what a big deal I think she is than to let people know that she's the one upholding John Maraldo's legacy at UNF. So that's why I say I kind of wish it had occurred to me to get Sarah up here today, because I know she's also very proud to be continuing the work that John started. Nonetheless, I'm thrilled to be here, to have a chance to have heard John's talk, to have an opportunity to reflect on it with everybody today. So in the presentation we've just heard, he's told us several stories about encounters, I think human-animal encounters and animal-to-animal encounters. And I feel like the talk itself was a kind of encounter, and it's one that I'm still processing. And in some ways, maybe it's an encounter between his established work in Japanese philosophy and this new direction he's taking, right? So part of me just wants to sit back and see what happens next. I thought maybe the best way to respond would be with a story of my own. It's a memory that came back to me when I was reading and processing John's presentation. So the story takes place, it must have been 2005 or 2006, because I was living in Japan, in Nagoya, studying language at Nanzan. And I never did become what we would call conversational in Japanese, but I was muddling through. And I had gone out that day to see Atsuta Jingu, so the shrine, Atsuta Shrine. And I knew very little about it, except that it was a major Shinto shrine and that it wasn't too far from my apartment by train. So I got there and I wandered around. It was very beautiful. Some of my best memories of Japan are the city shrines, right? When you cross that boundary from the outside world into the interior of these spaces, usually very green. So anyway, I was wandering around, and all of a sudden, a crowd surged from behind me, like right behind me, such that I had to join in with them and run with them in the direction that they were going, or else I really did think they might have knocked me over. So we all ran, we jogged sort of together over to this huge tree. And everyone's cell phones were out, right? They were all raising their arms high above their heads to try and film something that was happening at this tree. And I'm very short, so I couldn't see anything. I couldn't tell what was going on. And then I felt this very light tugging at my shirt sleeve, right at my elbow. Someone was pulling at my shirt. And there behind me was a very friendly, elderly woman. She was even shorter than me, and she's tugging at my sleeve and speaking in Japanese to me. And even though my Japanese was pretty lousy, I could understand what she was saying. It's the god of the tree. The tree god is here. And I thought, wow, I mean, I was stunned. That's incredible. And the next thing that I know, she's pushing both of us up into the crowd, through the crowd, because she's so short, she can't see anything either. And she was determined to get a better view. And she was taking me with her. And so we get up to the tree and sure enough, there's this snake, and it's huge. It's a huge snake, like really big. And it's not just sort of hanging out or just there going about its business. The best I can describe it thinking back is to say that it was surveying the crowd, right? So it was kind of wrapped around the branch. Its head was hanging off the branch and kind of, swaying back and forth over us, right? Sort of taking us all in, this crowd of people around it, taking us all in, I have to say, with approval. So the relationship at that moment for me was crystal clear, right? This was undoubtedly the tree god, and it had come to accept our offerings. Incredibly, someone had eggs. I mean, where do they come from, right? The eggs were laid at the base of the tree, offerings for the tree god. The Japanese woman explained to me that this was mezurashi. This was very rare. The tree god doesn't usually come out, she was saying to me. And so that we were very lucky. We were very lucky to be here on the day that the tree god showed itself. So years after this happened, I did look into it to try to investigate what I had experienced that day. And as I learned, this is actually, it is a thing. Atsuta Shrine is known for several sacred trees, and in one of them lives sacred snakes, and the priests there will feed the snakes eggs. So in the end, I don't know how rare what I witnessed was, right? And in my mind at the time, it was a once in a lifetime event. It might, though, have been just the daily feeding routine of a very well taken care of local snake. It might have been the daily offering to the local tree god. Whether it was snake or kami, for me, is not the issue. The crucial factor for me is that it was local, right? And this is something I've been thinking about a lot as my own work has veered into the area of philosophy of religion. And we can talk about how philosophy of religion as a discourse is Eurocentric in different ways, or is dominated by the concerns of monotheistic theologies. But to me, this is really concretely evident in the lack of any language that we have in mainstream philosophy of religion to talk about local gods, right? It lacks an interpretive framework to talk about what I just described as one of my favorite memories of Japan, which is crossing the boundary from the city street into the Shinto shrine, which is to enter a specific place, a specific realm, the one and only place in that city, the one and only place on our planet, right, where a specific local god can be met. I was looking back at some of Dr. Maraldo's own work in philosophy of religion, in particular, the essay in the collection on Kyoto School and Continental philosophy edited by Bret, Brian, and Jason here, called Nothing Gives, Marianne and Nishida on Gift Giving and God. And it felt like an interesting synchronicity to see that local gods make an appearance in that essay. It's not a central focus of the essay, but in the context of discussing the virtue of gift giving in Buddhism, Maraldo says, quote, "Some texts suggest that in giving to the monks and dedicating the gift to the local gods, the gods will look favorably upon the donors, but the gods too will share the karmic benefits," end quote. So this comment that Dr. Maraldo makes gestures toward a longer, ongoing relationship between the kami and the bodhisattvas in Japan, right? Mainstream Western philosophy of religion may indeed lack language for speaking about the local gods, but this does not mean that other philosophical traditions have not been able to speak about them, or maybe even to speak to them, right? Like his presentation today, Dr. Maraldo's essay on Marian and Nishida is concerned with an encounter. In that case, in that essay, the encounter is between the relative and the absolute. We might say that much of Dr. Maraldo's long and storied career has been about this encounter. But here today, we've heard about different encounters, and they aren't all of a type, right? They are specific, local, unrepeatable. We can't gather them all under a single heading. What have we encountered, right? Is it animal or is it divine? Is it snake or is it kami? I don't know, but I do want to say to Dr. Maraldo that I'm so very interested in seeing what happens next. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Dr. Maraldo.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was beautiful. That was a wonderful response. I'll let John respond to your response after Bret goes, so he can respond to both of you in tandem. And speaking of Bret, our second comment is from Bret Davis.
Okay, great to see everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I had to switch locations because a basketball game started in the alley behind my office window, so that wasn't working out. All right, if I might title my comments today, I'll call them the species-specific and interspecies stories we tell. The story of my friendship with my fellow hominid, John Maraldo, whom I consider a major mentor and pioneer predecessor on many of the paths I travel, goes back to the last of the Zen symposia held in 1998 in Arashiyama, a small town on the outskirts of Kyoto where green bamboo forests, pink cherry blossoms, and red maple leaves environ the storied Zen monastery of Tenryuji. Surrounded by the sounds of birds and catching occasional glimpses of other animals who co-inhabit this semi-rural region, we contemplated and debated what the Japanese Zen tradition still might have to offer the modern westernizing world. One of the things it has to offer is a different perspective on a topic I delved into a few years later when, after combing the libraries and bookstores of Kyoto, I wrote a paper on Zen Buddhism and the human-animal distinction for a book edited by David Jones and co-authored by a motley crew of Ccpc characters entitled Buddha, Nature, and Animality. Citing the same passage from Dogen that John ended his paper with today, I was struck in particular by two things. First, Zen's, and especially Dogen's, appreciation for non-human perspectives and worlds. A perspectivism that is neither anthropocentric nor anthropomorphic, and thus is distinct not only from the ethnocentric anthropocentrism of Western universalism, but also from the ethnocentric anthropomorphism of the Amerindian perspectivism explicated by the brilliant Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, whom John also commented on today. Second, Zen's and more broadly East Asian Buddhism's, Taoism's, Neo-Confucianism's, and Shinto's keen appreciation for the salutary lessons that humans have to learn from other animals and from less sentient parts of the natural world. So I won't say anything more about my own erstwhile research on this topic, but I would like to add one more comment on Zen, elaborating on John's opening remarks today about the connection between his talk and the book manuscript he recently completed entitled The Saga of Zen History and the Power of Legend. I strongly recommend that anyone interested in Zen read this book when it comes out later this year. It takes seriously recent critical scholarship on the history of Zen, but also takes these scholars to task for the hermeneutical naivete of their criticism of Zen legends as inaccurately representing historical facts. On the one hand, these scholars rightly disclose the political intrigue that has often shaped the revisionist histories found in canonical Zen texts. They separate the factual history from the fabricated stories about figures such as Bodhidharma and Huineng. But what they miss, from a practitioner's point of view, is the most important thing about these stories, namely that in the course of Zen training, they are treated as liberating legends rather than as factual historical records. In the course of Rinzai Zen koan training in particular, the legends of Zen are reenacted by each practitioner. The teacher tests whether the student is able to imbibe and revive not just the letter, but more importantly, the spirit of the law of these public cases. These powerfully liberating legends are indeed treated as stories in the sense that John talked about today. As you heard him say, stories hold open perspectives and possibilities. They weave together connections and relationships. They are placemaking and generate meaning. Stories need not be spoken in words. Indeed, the koans that a practitioner is called on to spiritedly embody and creatively appropriate are often embodied acts rather than, or in addition to, spoken words. John went on to say today, stories do not function as a set of self-contained propositions, objective and divorced from involvement of their claimer and leading up to an argument. Stories might be told by a single storyteller, human or not, and the trustworthiness of the teller may count for a lot. But stories gain their currency through repeated enactment. That is what makes them history. These lines from John's talk today well supplement what John has written in the Saga of Zen History and the Power of Legend. Yet they supplement rather than just repeat what was written there, since now he is making the claim, or at least the suggestion, a narrative case, if not a logical argument, for the fact that non-human animals also tell stories, that stories weave together cultures and traditions, not only for humans, but also for animals. Currently, I happen to be reading Peter Wohleben's The Hidden Life of Trees, which makes me wonder whether the arboreal communication in the forest communities he studies can also be thought of in this manner. In any case, in his book on Zen history, John makes the case that stories are what enable intergenerational communication. The retelling and reenacting of stories are what create a cultural tradition. In that book, as in today's talk, he also implies that sharing stories is an important means by which intercultural communication happens. So not just intergenerational, but also intercultural communication. I agree. Learning to inhabit another language and another culture is largely a matter of learning to understand and retell stories, from hardly translatable emotive expressions to idiomatic phrases, to the more elaborate traditional folklore and urban legends that we, in fact, allude to much more often than we realize. Yet what is most provocative in John's talk today is his suggestion that not only an intergenerational and intercultural, but also an interspecies sharing of stories is possible. Recently, 2 species of non-human animals have joined the community of my own household. My neighbor's dog, Banjo, who we've been taking care of, and 2 guinea pigs, Poppy and Buzz. It would be silly to say that we don't communicate with these housemates, or that they don't communicate with each other. But how to think about this kind of interspecies communication is challenging. I find intriguing and perhaps compelling John's suggestion that we expand our sense of what it means to share stories, that we think of the manner in which non-human animals pass down information, values, and patterns of behavior, that we think of this in terms of co-creating stories that weave together non-human cultures and traditions, and that we think of interspecies communication as at least analogous to the kind of intercultural sharing of stories that we humans engage in. I'm sympathetic to the line of questioning and thinking that John is pursuing in response to the work of ethnologists and ethologists, as well as Native American, African, and other traditional storytellers. However, let us not make it too easy on ourselves. Let us acknowledge our modern Western unease with, as well as our postmodern cross-cultural attraction to, this way of thinking, and ponder where they both come from. Are we, after all, romantically anthropomorphizing non-human animals? Or are we thoughtfully and judiciously, as well as soberly and scientifically, extending our critique of ethnocentrism and promotion of multiculturalism so as to conceive of a non-anthropocentric and non-anthropomorphic circulation of a variety of forms of storytelling, among which the human form is no longer the unquestioned archetype or measure? Recently I read, or reread, or realized I had never really read that carefully, Agamben's The Open, Man and Animal. Agamben traces the effects of what he calls the anthropological machine, by which he means the repeated insistence throughout the Western tradition on the human-animal distinction, a distinction that not only divides us from other animals, but also divides us from ourselves, insofar as it severs our bodily animalistic nature from our supposedly supernatural rational minds and spiritual souls. Agamben begins and ends his book by commenting on an enigmatic illustration found in a Hebrew Bible from the 13th century, which includes a scene at the end of the drama of biblical history in the days of the Messiah, when the righteous are depicted with animal heads. Agamben interprets this to mean that, quote, on the last day, the relations between animals and men will take on a new form, and that man himself will be reconciled with his animal nature. Agamben goes so far as to herald, again quoting, a new and more blessed life, one that is neither animal nor human, a higher stage beyond both nature and knowledge, beyond concealment and unconcealment. The language at the end of the quote is, of course, Heideggerian. And that's because, according to Agamben, Heidegger is the last great philosopher to insist on the human-animal distinction. In his 1929-30 lectures, Heidegger famously or infamously argued that animals are poor in world, Weltarm. Yet even Heidegger acknowledges, at one point in those lectures, that animal life, quoting Heidegger now, animal life is a domain which possesses a wealth of being open, of which the human world may know nothing at all, unquote. Several years earlier, in the early 20s, Rilke had gone much further to claim that it is animals, rather than humans, who truly see into the open. In the 8th of his Duino elegies, Rilke writes, Janet, I think your phone mic is on. With all eyes, the creature beholds the open. Only our eyes, as though reversed, encircle it on every side, as traps set round their unobstructed path to freedom. What is outside, we know from the animal's face alone. Although he is otherwise sympathetic to Rilke, when he returns to this topic in lectures from the early 1940s, Heidegger virulently objects. For Rilke, human consciousness, reason, logos, is precisely the limitation that makes human beings less capable than the animal. Are we supposed to turn into animals then? Because he has the word, human being, and he alone is the being who looks into the open. The animal, on the contrary, does not directly see the open, never does, not with a single one of all its eyes." Unquote. As is often the case, at the heart of this disagreement between the philosopher and the poet is an equivocation. They mean something different by seeing into the open. On the one hand, Heidegger thinks of the open in terms of a uniquely human exposure to and linguistic participation in the always delimited unconcealment of the being of beings. On the other hand, Rilke thinks that it is our linguistic and conceptual objectifications that close us off from nature, that alienate us from animals and from the openness with which they participate in the wholeness of the web of life. This is not the place to delve into this debate or to analyze and evaluate either Rilke's poetry or Heidegger's thought. What I want to say here, though, is that even after we acknowledge what scientists have shown, that Homo sapiens are indeed a species of animal, and even if we were to follow Agamben's advice and somehow render inoperative the anthropological machine, which not only separates us from other animals, but also lumps them all together, the animal, we still need to return to the question of what distinguishes humans from other animals, just as we need to stop talking abstractly about the animal and ponder the decisive differences between tigers and tiger sharks, spiders and spider monkeys. Even if we no longer think of ourselves as exclusively occupying the top rung of a hierarchical ladder of evolution, we still have to ask what distinguishes our specific branch of the multi-limbed family tree of life. To put this question, I'll close with this, in terms of John's talk today, if we're going to extend the semantic range of stories to include the manner in which all other animals, and perhaps even plants, each species in its own specific manner, are communicating, how should we talk about the peculiarity, the specific strangeness of the kinds of stories we humans tell? Are we the only animals who are aware that we are telling stories? Are we the only animals who tell stories about our stories, like we're doing today? Would other animals even dream of whiling away a Saturday afternoon wondering about what it means to tell stories? Presumably not. The question is, what difference does this make? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bret. That was wonderful. And now we'll turn things over to John, who can respond to Leah and Bret.
Yes, well, boy, these are very rich responses. I wish we had a few more hours to sit around and talk more freely around a table. So I'm going to just pick out a couple of points and see if I might use the compass that's provided by Leah and Bret to further the conversation. I very much appreciated Leah's story about her encounter in the Shinto shrine in Nagoya and her encounter with what we call, or what she has called, the tree god, the tree kami, and that had metamorphosed into a snake. So this, I think, connects also with some of the themes that Bret has brought up about anthropomorphizing and our anthropocentric tendencies. So this is what I want to say about that. In the case of the Shinto shrine, it occurred to me first that this we designate as a sacred space in which certain things can happen that in more secular society are not recognized. It occurred to me that for many of the Amerindians that Viveros de Castro talks about, their entire environment, their entire world is like the Shinto shrine. It is a kind of sacred space, or it is a space inhabited by spirits, as some of the translations say, at the same time acknowledging that the word spirit doesn't quite do it. So we don't really know whether these peoples are anthropomorphizing, seeing human traits in non-human animals, or whether they are, what should we call it, theomorphizing, finding gods and spirits everywhere, whether they're animistic, what exactly is going on. There is a kind of struggle of translation here that occurs because these very philosophically minded anthropologists are questioning the terms, the categories, the language of our translation, and how we are to educate ourselves about the points of view of the Amerindians in this case, or of people of other cultures. The anthropologists, of course, unlike me and casual readers, have learned the languages, but then they are obligated, they obligate themselves to translate for us. So they deal with these issues very in a very open manner, the issues of anthropomorphizing and anthropocentrism. Now, I see some connections here with a few of the things that Bret has mentioned in a very rich and wide-ranging response. One of the issues is whether or not we should try to assume a non-anthropocentric, a non-anthropomorphic viewpoint when describing other cultures, other animal behavior, whatever it is, whether that is something that should be, if it could be at all, avoided. My own take would be that it can't be avoided. There is no view from nowhere, but there is an alternative, and that alternative is to, this is the work of philosophers, to question the degree to which we impose on others. We read the world simply through naive storytelling without recognizing the points of view of storytellers of other cultures and other species. So that I'm suggesting that anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism is probably unavoidable if we try to assume that it's not there, but that it can be radically varied for us when we learn other languages, other human languages, and when we learn to whatever extent we can the so-called languages of the animals. Bret has also talked about, or suggested, if I understand him right, that Dogen in the Zen tradition has presented a vision which is neither anthropocentric nor anthropomorphic. But I think Dogen is, or was, very aware of the anthropomorphism that is, the anthropocentrism that is specifically unavoidable. He does, for example, when he assumes the Buddhist position that human beings, it is the human realm, the loka of the ningen, of the jinkan, of the humans, which is capable of awakening. In our conversation here, that awakening would be to open a space for the recognition of other viewpoints. So there's something specific about the human being, which I think Dogen recognizes, and Bret certainly recognizes it. You do in your final question about the strangeness of specifically human stories as opposed to non-animals, non-human stories. Of course, there, I think what I need to do, and I'm totally fascinated by now, is to learn from the anthropologists who have taken the trouble to learn radically different languages, specifically the languages which are now endangered and which are not going to be around much longer. And of course, their speakers are also endangered, even if they were to live on in a completely transformed way by being acculturated into a massive predominant culture. So there's something even strange about talking about human stories as if there were some category that is universally accepted among all the cultures about what it means to be human, or what is a human story as opposed to a non-human story. So it's by varying our sources of stories that we're able to deal with the problems of anthropomorphizing, anthropocentrizing, maybe so-called animism or theocentrism, theomorphism, finding spirits everywhere, all of these sort of categories which are very much today in play. I want to finish with just one comment about the work of Agamben and the notion of the space, the open, seeing into the open. This resonated with me, for me, with what Van Doren talked about as leaving a place for, leaving an opening for the mere existence, the ability of other peoples to live and to tell their stories. And of course, I'm including there the non-human story. So leaving open a space is, I think, where we need to go next to come back to Leah's question. This is where we need to go back. And one clue is given in a statement by Rilke about objectifying, which closes us supposedly off from the world. But of course, Heidegger himself recognized the power and the potency of non-objectifying thinking. And I think that they were very much at least aligned in that regard. So with that, with those few words, let's open it up to some more discussion.
Thank you so much, John. So just a quick review of our discussion protocol. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, either use the raise hand function that's under the reaction button to the right at the bottom of your screen, or just type into the chat question. So the first person who's already got in line is Barry Cotton. And then also if Leah and Bret have anything to say also. Let Barry ask a question, and then if Leah and Bret have any follow-up, that's fine after that. So go ahead, Barry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? First of all, I want to congratulate John on receiving the award. I'm sure it's very well deserved. I first met John in 1972 in Tokyo at Jochi Daigaku, Sophia University, when I was a student in his course on Heidegger. And the following summer, together we attended a week-long session It's a period of Zen meditation. And it was the first for both of us. So now, 48 years later, as regards the famous Zen koan and John's talk, I need to ask him, does a dog have a Buddha nature? John?
Good luck. Good luck, John.
I'm more interested in whether a dog has Buddha nature.
Okay.
Does Buddha have dog nature? And the answer is yes.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, thank you.
Thank you,
so much,
John.
John. Barry, do you have a follow-up on that?
Is there a syllogism there?
Barry, it's great to see you again after so many years. You are one of the people who introduced me to how to do things in Japanese culture, and the Shinto, the public bath. I'll never forget that.
Wonderful. Good to see old friends together.
Thank you, John.
If Bret or Leah wants to make a quick follow-up, we can do that. And then next in line after that would be Michiko-san. Leah or Bret, do you have?
I'm happy to turn it over for discussion at this point from me.
Okay.
Yeah, if there's, I mean, if there's if other people don't have questions, I'd be happy to talk, but I'd rather open it up to other people since we have such limited time.
Okay, good. Well, next in line is Michiko-san.
We have been on this topic for some time. We have a group, Colombians and people engaged in Japanese philosophy on nature. And so, you know, I'm just picking up from where we left off, so to speak, which may come as kind of out of the blue to some of you. So please excuse me if I'm jumping into a question. You know, as often in this conversation, this interspecies communication, learning a different language, that kind of ideas came up. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm specifically now thinking about the disappearance of the Ainu language, Jason. We communicated about this. And what's that native people in America who talks about the sugar moon? Ojibwe?
Ojibwe, yes.
Ojibwe, yes. Those people are struggling. I knew too late. The very last native speaker died about 10 years ago. With him disappeared this entire knowledge of the Ainu way of living. And Ojibwe people, they are now struggling to keep this world intact. So I'm really interested in how we deal with that, because whether we know it or not, willy-nilly, we speak the language of the strong, the conqueror, English language. I speak English because that's the language that won the popular culture by Beatles. I always think if they spoke in Spanish, today we might be actually speaking Spanish more. So it feels to me that we are not critical enough as to how we choose a language that we want to learn. And also in terms of, say, we all, as academics, we went through comps, you know, I mean, we had to take some languages and then pass them, and then some other subjects and pass them. If we start to require one of these dying languages, even 1 year, as a part of a requirement, we might be able to participate more meaningfully in keeping some things from going to extinct. So I feel sympathetic. It's nice to be able to learn the octopus language, for example. Do you know? I mean, it's been a big thing lately. But it is also within our responsibility to not to lose this diversity, worldviews, myths, because once we lose mythos, we lose our logos. Logos and mythos, I think they're so closely connected, and modern illness today, beginning with the breach of the Capitol and everything, we are not connecting in our brains all these thinking, and somehow we are at danger. I feel more danger. I feel, sometimes uncontrollable anxiety because we are losing something, it feels to me. So it's nice to be able to talk about animals and non-animals and so on. At the same time, we need to really have a conversation with our own animal instincts and all that, and how to deal with modernity, super modernity, technology, all these things, because I think we are emaciating. We are getting smaller and weaker. If I'm left alone in the wilderness, I die in one day. I don't know what to eat. I don't know what animals may protect me. In other words, we are losing a lot of things. And somehow, I think John's paper, in a way, is a kind of a reaction to or wanting to protect this original fabric of unity. And I appreciate it. At the same time, I feel so much danger coming from my fellow human beings, if I may say. So I just wanted to add this dimension because we seem to forget at least some parts. And the language we speak, so long as we speak any language, human language, we need to acknowledge the fact that we are speaking that grammar. And then can we expand that grammar? I think there are other ways of approaching this very interesting question. So that's my whatever penny's worth, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Michiko-san. John?
Yes, just thank you, Michiko. I feel the same danger. I'll just make 3 very quick comments. First, about the Ainu. There is a fairly good film that's available maybe on Netflix or Amazon Prime or some venue about the attempts of the Ainu people to keep going their language and their rituals, particularly the Iomante or bear ritual, where a bear is sacrificed. That particular ceremony was outlawed by the Japanese government for some time, but I understand that a court case has settled in favor of the Ainu people. And if you look at this film, you will see that at least some of the people are still speaking their own language. So what about us? We don't speak Ainu. You're speaking English because you're in an American society. I don't know if any of your neighbors speak Japanese, but this is the world we're in. We don't choose the language we grow up in. And often we don't particularly choose with any great range of possibilities the languages that we learn as foreign languages. It's somewhat regrettable to me that, especially in the past 3 or 4 decades, English has become the lingua franca of the world, because this means not only that English is being spread thin, but it means that so many native English speakers no longer feel it necessary to learn a foreign language. For me, the ethical dimension of this, and it's one which recognizes not the exclusive privilege of human beings, but it does recognize human difference. If there is, if human beings really are essentially different from other animals, that can only mean ethically that we are more responsible. We are more responsible for the condition of the world and for the threat of extinction of peoples, languages, and animals.
So Michiko-san, I saw your hand come back up. Did you have a follow-up?
I said the Ainu language died. By definition, what I mean to speak the language is that you have your elders, you have your unrelated, but linguistically related grandparents or aunts or uncles. If you have a question, you could go and ask, what could this word mean? Because it's not in the dictionary, it's in the usage. And only some people know the local variations within the Ainu language. So when this man Kayano, I met him in Biradori, and he was very angry with the Japanese government. And by association, I'm also guilty. I willy-nilly partake in this ignorance, and also ignoring of the dying culture. And the fact that this ritual goes on, those people don't really speak in the same way. They're not native, there is a difference. And I think they keep it now as a museum piece. That is to me almost like an insult. But of course, it's better to have museum than no. So there I accept it, but I feel that language is so fragile. And unless we make a conscious effort to keep it, it may not, anyway, so that's another thing. But also, I am translating all the time from Japanese to English. Why do I do that? Because I think it's not enough yet. Whenever we have in Japanese philosophy, any intercultural philosophy, information we have is not enough for us to really engage in creative work. And unless you're fluent, bilingual, trilingual, multilingual, you don't have access to the other culture, other experiences. So I feel even more the necessity of a very good, dependable translation. So I feel that, I think we have to go in many prongs, not just one, but I think I became very sensitive about this dynamic living nature of language. It's not something, some signified, all these things. It's human life itself, it's expression. So the more we are exposed to these fragility, I think we are a little better placed as thinkers in this particular day and age anyway. So.
Thank you, Michiko-san. We should probably move on, but thank you. That was a very powerful set of reflections. Lucas put in the name of the film that John alluded to, the Ainu film. It's in the chat. People are interested. And next in line is Jin Park, please.
Thank you. Hi, John. Nice seeing you after all these years. And thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I think it's really great for you to connect this storytelling in the context of philosophy and the movie to the animal-human division issues. I have two connected questions. The first one is about this storytelling. I really wholly agree with you about the importance of considering storytelling in our philosophizing. And I myself use the expression narrative philosophy when I deal with women's philosophy. Now, if we will think about the storytelling or narrative in the context of philosophy, now, as opposed to what? So as opposed to perhaps the principle, rationalization, and so on and so forth. Now, if we really think that the Western philosophy especially has been based on this non-storytelling side, then now when we emphasize storytelling in this context, what do you think that what has philosophy trying to do by excluding storytelling? So as Michiko said, mythos and the logos and mythos kind of division has a long history, right? So why has philosophy emphasized that division so strongly? What did philosophy want to accomplish? And I think it has to do with also, in a way, the human animality. So my second question is really related to the human imagination about other species is always related to human imagination of other human beings. The kind of hierarchical relationship between human and non-human is directly connected to the human and non-human within human being, right? So for example, certain gender is not human enough, a certain race is not human enough. So in your discussion about this expanding the scope of philosophy in the human animal division and the kind of blurring the boundary and have a communication with them, how would you connect it with to more social issues that we are facing now by treating other human beings as non-human beings, and that kind of creating that kind of hierarchy as we have been creating hierarchy between humans and non-humans? Thank you.
Yes, Jean, it's very good to see you again. And actually, I wanted to point other people to some of your work about storytelling and the hermeneutics of it. For example, I just used in this book about Zen history, your analysis of the story of nuns and cutting the cat. So, you know, in what you said just now, once in a while, I lost the sound. There was just, so I'm not sure I caught it all, but I will, what I heard was first a question about why philosophy tends to exclude storytelling. As for that, of course, we all know if we read Plato that there's a lot of storytelling and reflection on storytelling, but that is supposedly then the mythos, the mythical part of Plato that is kind of takes second place to what he's really talking about. So all I could say is perhaps there is a tendency in predominant Western, and I would have to say more analytical philosophy, to control what counts as truth, so that stories, because they don't consist of propositions, and propositions because they are thought to be the sole containers of truth, the stories are outliers. They cannot express the way that a proposition expresses truth, that it is so designed and is so defined. And so I think we need to perhaps look at this historically, but we can look at it today as an opportunity to learn from people like Heidegger, who looks at truth in a quite different way, and also his critics, but at least people who try to read him, to see other ways that what truth means in story form, in fiction form, for example, in the form of the genre of literature that we call fiction. So this is a kind of liberating research, I would say, to find or to think more about the kind of truth that that stories inhabit. Now, I think you also asked at the end a second question, and some of it didn't come through because I lost the sound. So if you had a second question, could you tell me what it is again, please?
Sorry, yes. So it has to do with the relationship with this, the division between human animal and non-human animal. And
Yes.
then this division reflected in social structure. So human beings' imagination about animal in a hierarchical way,
Yes.
putting human being at the center, is also reflected in the social structure, right? So what would you say about this kind of relationship between this social structure, hierarchical social structure, and then hierarchical species, right?
Okay. So I would presume very much so that the human non-human division is reflected in social structures, and I would just point to an area of scholarship where that is most visible, and that is again in the anthropologists who are studying non-predominant cultures, so-called indigenous peoples, who have a different way of dividing humans and animals, and they have completely different social structures. And once again, because they are no longer dominant and even able to exist, much less thrive in the modern social world, we are soon losing an opportunity to learn more precisely just how it is that social structures reflect the human non-human division. And so if we lose that, we're losing another way to really to probably to save the earth. So this is my feeling.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jen. Jen's good to see you. Hope things are well on your side of the country. Next, live from the Saijo Shrine is Tim Freeman.
Aloha. So I really appreciated that presentation, John, and the comments by Leah and Bret. I have a quick question, but I wondered if I might be permitted to share my screen. I think you would all appreciate it for a background. I think it says I can share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. I think you will really appreciate this background. So I live in the forest in Hawaii. John, you mentioned the alala. And what we're hearing here is the apapane, which I think are these incredible, most amazing birds. And I'll just move ahead. This is, that's the apapane. So I often listen to these birds. And John, I have this question that when you mentioned perspectivism and you talked about that it's not a relativism, and I was wondering how you I know you didn't have time to go over the argument, but I'm wondering if you might say a word about that, because I can understand how perspectivism, when we're only talking about humans, does not lead to relativism. But when we expand it beyond the human realm, how do we avoid, isn't it, I'm back to this question about perspectivism and relativism. Sometimes when I'm listening to the birds, and I have a friend who comes over and he plays slack key guitar, and the birds sometimes respond, they respond. And so sometimes we feel like we're trying to communicate with them. And as I'm sitting there listening, I'm thinking the birds are listening to us and thinking, oh, these creatures don't have proper syntax. You know, so what do you think about this question about perspectivism when we expand it beyond the human realm? Can we avoid relativism?
Okay, so this is a question actually that the proponent of perspectivism, there are several, but especially this one is the anthropologist who works mostly with the Amur Indians of Amazonia, and that's Eduardo Riberos de Castro. So he has given a series of lectures, I think at Oxford or Cambridge, on why exactly perspectivism, as the anthropologists use the term, is not relativism. In fact, he says it's at right angles to a division between relativism and universalism. So I want to say only this much, because it's a rather entangled argument full of examples. It's meant, the perspectivism here is meant as an explanation of the world that is experienced by these Amur Indians. And yet Viveros is presenting this as a valid theory, as the best available theory to understand that world. And so he's not just presenting another perspective, one among the many others. He is presenting an overarching theory. Okay, so the theory itself is not relativist. It may not be absolute. It's a fallible theory, as any scientific theory is, but it itself is not meant to be one perspective among others. And yet, a lot of it makes sense outside of the examples drawn from Amerindians in Amazonia. Another example, I think, is the story about the San or Bushman hunter in the Kalahari Desert. So he tries to put himself in the body of the kudu antelope that he is tracking, and to see things from its point of view, just as the Amerindians, the Puro Amerindians, are trying to put themselves into the perspective of the jaguar as they see, in order, in that case, to avoid being the hunted rather than the hunter. So this is at least how I would approach your particular question. I also want to say that in some cases I am very wary of anthropomorphic tendencies among recent popularizers of tree languages and plant languages, and people like Peter Bolleben and the great Italian plant physiologist Stefano Mancuso, who I think go a little bit too far in two respects, in imposing categories that really belong more to human beings onto trees and other plants, and saying, for example, that trees have an equivalent to a human brain in their root system, and they make an individual tree makes a decision. And sometimes the same way that the neurons in the human brain make a decision, and one tree alerts all the others through a kind of decision of the danger of an impending disease. I think they go too far in that kind of anthropomorphizing, but I also think that thereby they are failing to recognize the kind of, shall we call it, animal intelligence and plant intelligence that human beings display. And this is what we used to call instinct in human beings, or perhaps intuition, sort of anything that diverges from so-called rational decision theory, where we sit and think through a problem and for particular reasons then decide on a solution. There are ways that the human being, the human body, interacts with others within the world that are shared by all these other animals, and perhaps to a certain extent by plants, at least to the extent that plants are sentient beings. So the danger is not only anthropomorphizing the plants and animals from our Western perspective, it's also the lack of the failure to recognize in human beings other forms of sensibility and sentience.
Thank you so much, John. Bret has a question and a follow-up. And thank you, Tim.
Yeah, I'd actually like to respond to Tim's question. And John, see what you think about this, because this was the point I was alluding to when I contrasted what I see in Zen's and Dogen's, in particular perspectivism, which I've been working on, using that phrase, perspectivism. And I recently read Viveros de Castro and the perspectivism he talks about in the context of Amerindian cultures. And I think they're quite different, because what Viveros de Castro talks about is an explicitly and avowedly anthropomorphic perspectivism. And it's precisely by being overtly anthropomorphic that it evades relativism, he says. That's how he contrasts it with relativism, because he says, for them, it's not that some animals became human, like our evolutionary theory, but it's the opposite. That in the beginning was that everyone was human, and some humans lost their human bodies and so all these other animals have these other bodies, but really they're humans. And so shamans and other cases, we can get inside there, but to get inside their perspective is to see and feel and interact as humans. It's just that we see them in their bodies, and that's really quite different than what I see in Dogen and others, where it's really a kind of openness to a non-anthropomorphic perspectivism, which is questioning, as Thomas Nagel says, what is it like to be a bat? Not what is it like to be a bat who's really a human trapped in a bat's body, as it were, but what is it like to experience the world as a tick, as Uxkol writes about, or as other forms of animals, and whether that can evade or should evade relativism is an open question for me. But I think that just to mark the difference between what Viveros de Castro is talking about with Amerindian perspectivism to other ways in which we might want to use that term. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Bret, once again, unfortunately, a couple of the key points you were making disappeared because the sound stopped. And one in particular was when you were talking about Dogen, and you used the expression, if I remember right, experiencing such and such as, you were giving examples of how Dogen's perspectivism is radically different from, say, Viveros's. But you were giving, if you could.
Yeah, well, I'll say something I didn't say, but more to your point. So when Dogen talks about in Genjo Koan and elsewhere, he talks about don't think that fish experience the ocean the way that we experience the ocean, or don't think and he gives these sort of various examples. He's doing something very different than what Viveros de Castro is talking about. The Amerindians are saying. Because for them, to experience it as a fish would experience is to experience it as a human would see. It's just that we can't see that that's how fish experience it as well. So it's an avowedly anthropomorphism, because he says that all perspectives in these cultures are human perspectives. It's just the difference between the perceiver and the perceived. So we see bodies, and bodies can take various different animal forms, including human forms. But the seeing is always human, and that's very different. That's really the opposite of what Dogen, I think, is talking about.
John, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I too see these visions as extremely different, and it's important to differentiate between them. So just a couple of points. Viveros, when he says that all of these points of view are anthropocentric, because originally humans were these animals, and they're to some extent interchangeable, just as in the story of the Zuni people, the deer might have been in the past a human being, and it might not have been, and it might take human form, and it might not. So we don't know whether this is somehow deer or animal centric or human centric, and so I would not agree that Viveros's perspectivism is anthropocentric in the way that we normally use the word, because the word human has a different range of meanings for these peoples. And I think they recognize that the jaguar, for example, has its own point of view, and it's not another human point of view. But somehow, for these people, it is conceivably possible to assume the point of view of a jaguar. And if anything, in reading Viveros, I have the impression that it's neither a question of anthropomorphism or not. It's a question of seeing everything as somehow, to use his word, spirit, spirit infected, spiritualized, so that all of these forms are there's a communion and a commutation of spirits going on, and not just the particular forms as they are visible to us. So now in the case of Dogen, we have something again completely different. But Dogen, when he says it is not the case that fish use as water and fish experience as water what we experience as water. So Dogen also, it seems to me, recognizes this we and our radically different perspective on the world, and the fact of a completely different perspective that fish might have. At least, though, he is saying that fish do have a point of view, and that is that's what counts, I think, in the language of Dogen in this respect.
Excellent. Very, very exciting conversation. I'll throw out too that Lucas has put the Viveros title of the text we've been discussing in the chat. So those who don't know it, you can see the citation in the chat. Thank you, Lucas. And we have time for maybe one more question. I don't have anybody in line yet, but if someone would like to make a final comment or question. Okay, well, I'll just wrap it. Oh, Francesca, please.
Thank you for this occasion to make last question. Thank you, John, for your speech or your stories. Thanks, Leah, Bret, for your answers and stories, and for organize, obviously, all that. I have a question about philosophy, because I heard about other disciplines and languages, and I really liked the way you, John, challenge our expectation about how a philosophy speech looks like. And I am very fascinating in continuing to challenge the boundaries of philosophy. So my question is, how can we philosophers open philosophy to the non-human? And how can we, if there is a way, how can we make philosophy like less human, and maybe integrate your today lessons in the practice of philosophy, maybe even in the university, maybe. I was wondering if you have some suggestions there. You, John, Bret, or Leah, of course. Thanks.
Well, I would say, first of all, by having discussions like this, we open philosophy to the non-human, and by paying more attention to so-called indigenous or so-called native voices, and into animal voices, as at least these are translated by the ethologists and the anthropologists. And if we're not able to do that kind of field work ourselves, to open philosophy to these other voices, is at least my way of trying to open myself to the non-human world. This is especially challenging because I live in an environment where the only animals I see are people's pets, or else the squirrels in my yard and the birds that come to the bird feeder. So I'm thrilled when I see wild animals, but I realize that exoticizing these other fellow sentient beings on Earth is not necessarily the way to learn to listen to them. So once again, I think open philosophy to these other voices. There are wonderful philosophically informed anthropologists to read today. Besides, of course, Viveros, there's Tim Ingold, there's Roy Wagner, who wrote about him. There's Philippe Descola, and these are voices that in Agamben that Bret has talked about. These are voices that we need to listen to. Understand, of course, that we're listening through the language that we happen to speak and read, and understanding a little bit about translation.
Thank you so much, John. Well, we come to the end of our program today. I think I, like many people in the circle, when we first experienced philosophy when we were young, it was the experience of our whole world opening up, kind of deconstriction. And then as we pursued professional philosophy, we were always talking about everything, but from an increasingly constricted position and constricting position. And the circle was founded to remember what it was that got us into philosophy in the first place. Things opening up, new bridges, trying to find ways to get a sense of our blind spots, cultivating generosity and curiosity, appreciation for languages, other disciplines, and the full spectrum of humanity, as well as all of our affiliations. And John, you really been a pioneer for that, for all of us, really have shown us the way. So I'm so happy for your presentation today, and immensely grateful, as I know we all are, for your decades and decades of pioneering work. So deep bows to you and huge thanks. I'd also like to thank Leah and Bret for their beautiful responses. Those were terrific. I'd like to thank Jennifer Liu for designing the certificate. She did that completely by hand and spent a long time, artist that she is, getting it just right. So you'll see it's quite beautiful. We all look forward to reading the Saga of Zen History. I know myself, I'm thrilled to read it. And I look forward to seeing everyone in person, really anywhere at this point. But that will include, I hope, next year in Tallinn, a beautiful city. And I know when we are able to see each other in person, it's going to be a beautiful thing. So thank you all very much. And John, deep, deep bows to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I bow to all of you. Thank you so much for this wonderful occasion. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for showing up, spending your Saturday with us. See you next year. Be careful, be healthy, be kind, help others, and see you all soon. Thank you.